One of my all-time favorite games, the latest Hitman release, is finally getting a sequel, and I don't think they're gonna call it Hitman 2, but let's just look into it a bit more. I am a big fan of the Hitman series, and I've been following it ever since the very first release. The series has a fantastic and really crazy story, some amazing gameplay, and it basically is a puzzle, if you really look at it that way. You have to have a target in some level, and you have to be able to get rid of them silently without anyone seeing you. And if you don't want to do it that way, you can go in guns blazing, but if you've ever played a Hitman game before, you know that that likely isn't going to be the way to solve the problem. Now, taking all this into consideration and my long-term love of the series, I gotta say that Hitman in 2012, called Hitman Absolution, that game was pretty bad. It got almost everything wrong about a Hitman game that you'd want, and unfortunately, that game almost killed the franchise. And I was so happy to see Hitman come out in 2016, which is just called Hitman. Now, folks, I just gotta say this, because I get really upset whenever companies do this. Don't call your game just Hitman or just whatever the original name of the game is by itself. We already had a Hitman game which came out years ago, so when you call something Hitman again, it confuses the audience because they think it's the exact same game from the past, even though it's not. And what's really funny is Hitman from 2016 is one of the best Hitman games ever made, if not the best Hitman game ever made. Now unfortunately it was done in an episodic format, which I was okay with, but it didn't do very well when it came to sales. People really didn't understand what they were getting, and they weren't really basically confident about what was going to be delivered. Fortunately though, at the end of the season, we got a really fantastic Hitman game that just really came together into its own. It had a really interesting story, fantastic visuals, great gameplay, and they had a lot of elements that kept getting added again and again that made the older stages a lot more fun to go along, including one that was basically Christmas themed, where you had to take out the thieves from Home Alone, which was hilarious. There's even another stage where there's like Gary Busey, and look, there's a lot of really cool stuff that they did for this release, and I'm very happy that they did it. But there are a couple of issues that I don't want to see them repeat, and here's how we're going to play this. First off, I don't want those target system things back in the game, where they basically have this timed exclusive target that only lasts for like a day or two. Sometimes, surprisingly, I get busy, and I can't sit down to sit there and play a Hitman game at a specific time because eventually I'm just gonna miss it if I don't play it, and I get really annoyed. That whole Gary Busey sequence was only available for a couple of days, and then you could never play it again. Look, after I've completed the first go-around and you've tagged my time and put me up against a scoreboard, I'd like to be able to go back and try it again. And this time I don't get on the scoreboard, fine, but I would love to see that gameplay come back again and again, and unfortunately they've added all these really interesting characters that you're supposed to assassinate that you can't go back and do again. That's something that I'm not really happy with, and I hope in the new one they kind of fix that, because it's just all this really interesting gameplay that they're making that just goes away and disperses. But I think the problem I'm fearing the most, despite the fact I'm actually very engaged and very looking forward to the next Hitman game, is that please, who's ever out there at Warner Brothers or whoever's making the game now, IO, whatever, don't call it Hitman 2. We already have a Hitman 2. We already had a Hitman game. Don't call it a sequel, because if you do, it's going to confuse people even further, making it think that this is just a remaster of the second game that already came out. Every time you guys mess up these narratives and these stories and you create these really weird complex naming schemes, you confuse the general population. Hitman, whatever they're going to call it next, should be called Hitman Season 2 or some other variation of the name to get people into it. If you call it Hitman 2, I'm gonna be so angry. There was no reason for Hitman 2016 to be poorly received other than the fact that it was episodic and the name was a little bit confusing. If they go back to the episodic format, maybe people will be okay with it now, because I'm hoping that 2016 kind of proved to people that they can make a really good game in the episodic format, but at the same time, they need to fix out their pricing structure. They need to make sure that there's a lot of elements there that kind of click and make it easy to consume for consumers. And if you call it Hitman 2 and generally confuse all those gamers out there again, you're going to regret it. You guys made a fantastic game before, and I think if you take that exact same idea and philosophy and bring it into the next one, I think this next game is going to do pretty well.